Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. My name is Liz Eberline. I am the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum outside of Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this special guest curator-led virtual walkthrough of the museum's popular online exhibit, Sojourner Truth, with Kerri Lee Alexander, former NWHM Education and Public History Fellow and the curator of this exhibit. Our program today is part of the National Women's History Museum's Black History Month celebration in honor of generations of African American women who struggled through adversity to achieve full citizenship in American society and who have led, acted, inspired, and advocated for a better present and future for all generations of Americans. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording this presentation so that it can be available on our website following the event. Kerri will be answering questions at the end of her presentation. So if you would like to ask a question, please do use the Q&A function on the toolbar that can be found at the bottom of your screen. You may ask your question at any time during the presentation, and Kerri will try to answer as many of those questions as she can when she's finished with her presentation. As an itinerant preacher, abolitionist, and women's rights activist, Sojourner Truth spoke out against the injustices affecting various communities. Here to walk us through the exhibit and talk about this extraordinary woman is the curator of this exhibit. Carrie Lee Alexander is a researcher, curator, and educator from Bloomfield, Connecticut. Currently, she is a PhD candidate in U.S. history at Howard University, where her research is focused on the sale and separation of enslaved families in the 19th century and the mitigation of separation trauma. She also serves as a teaching associate for the history department and the inaugural graduate student mentor for the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship in partnership with the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. From 2018 to 2020, Kerri served as the Education and Public History Fellow at the National Women's History Museum, where she curated content for the museum's online platform focused on the contributions of American women. Through her fellowship, she had the privilege of curating the digital exhibit on Sojourner Truth that was featured on the homepage of google.com to kick off Black History Month in 2019. Kerri has extensive experience in civic engagement and public history and has established various initiatives driven towards justice, ethics, and service. She has also presented her research at various conferences and most recently presented her paper entitled Say Her Name, Black Women and the Politics of Invisibility in American Patriotism at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. This past month, Kerri was appointed to serve as the Assistant Vice President of Student Affairs and Chief Inclusion Officer at Xavier University of Louisiana. Kerri holds a Bachelor of Science in Arts Administration, Nonprofit Management from Wagner College, and a Master of Arts in Theological Studies from Princeton Theological Seminary. We are thrilled to have her back with us, especially since she just moved and things are a little crazy for her. So even if it's just for the next hour, please welcome Kerri Lee Alexander. Kerri?
Hello, thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, everyone. I'm so grateful to be with all of you. It is indeed a privilege and an honor to talk about Sojourner Truth this afternoon with all of you. And so I am going to get set up here by sharing my screen so we can walk through the exhibit. So hopefully you're able to see that. And I am so excited because not only have I been able to spend some time with Sojourner Truth, but I've been able to curate an exhibit that has been viewed widely thanks to my work at the National Women's History Museum and with the Google platform. And so it is, again, an honor to talk about some of the beautiful things that I learned about her story while I was doing this research. So I'm sure many of us have already heard of Sojourner Truth. And if you haven't, you're also in for a treat because her life was truly inspiring and she made such an impact on so many of us. But even for those of us who haven't heard of her or those of us who have, there's so much more that we have to learn about her, right? And so there's so much history and beauty in her tremendous journey. And I'm excited to go through some of these defining moments with you today. So I'm going to also give you a little bit of a behind the scenes look at how and why I felt that some of these things would be important for us to include and talk about when we're talking about Sojourner Truth. So with that, I'm excited to get started. I hope you're excited too. So, as we begin today, our exploration, I started with a quote by the historian Nell Irvin Painter. And, you know, I've had the privilege of spending some time researching and learning about Sojourner's story. And I am by no means the absolute expert on Sojourner Truth, but I consider that person to actually be Nell Irvin Painter. And she wrote a book on Sojourner Truth called Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol. And that was really helpful for me too when I was conducting my research. So I highly recommend that book if you want to learn more about Sojourner's story. And so Dr. Painter starts off saying, quote, at a time when most Americans thought of slaves as male and women as white, truth embodied a fact that still bears repeating. Among the Blacks are women, and among the women, there are Blacks. And so this is a significant quote because it's important to remember that Truth and so many other enslaved women at the time were facing oppression and injustice uniquely, right? So not only were they facing injustice and discrimination as African Americans, they were also facing discrimination and various limitations as women, right? And so that's what this quote is getting at, is that not only were they Black, but they also were women. And so unfortunately, they were frequently relegated to kind of the lowest rungs of society because of all of these factors that were piled up against them. And so that's kind of what Dr. Painter is saying. And throughout Truth's story, we're able to see how she faced and resisted against both racism and sexism along her journey. And so I think that's really a beautiful part of her story, is that she's fighting both of those things and able to accomplish what she has, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, Truth is a recognizable figure in history. She was an itinerant preacher, which means she's traveled all over to preach, as well as an abolitionist and an outspoken activist. And she even went, at one point in her life, she went overseas to promote the abolitionist cause and talk about her story, right? So she was doing this widely. And one of the things that is so special about her journey is that we actually get to hear about this from her through her autobiography. And so I'll talk about that later, but that's beautiful because especially, you know, later on in life, she goes on to be famously misquoted for something she never actually said, but we actually have a written record of her story and her words. And I think that's amazing. And then, you know, as I wrote, as an itinerant preacher, abolitionist, and women's rights activist, Sojourner Truth spoke out against the injustices affecting various communities. Propelled by her faith, Truth traveled extensively to speak about her experiences as both a woman and a former slave. Although the most popular quotes attributed to her legacy are inaccurate, Truth's activism led her to become one of the most recognizable figures in American history. And so, as you can tell, I'm nerded out about Sojourner Truth. I love her story. And so, her birth. So she actually was born Isabella Baumfree. And so she was born near the Roundout Creek in the town of Hurley, Ulster County, New York. And the actual date of her birth is unknown. So even in her autobiography, she notes that she doesn't remember, she wasn't told when she was born. And that's kind of common during that period, right? But it's believed that she was born enslaved around 1797 on the estate of Colonel Johannes Hardenberg, where her parents were also enslaved. And so this right here is a Google Maps image of it. And one of the benefits of working on the Google platform is that you can actually virtually travel to see these places. So as Liz mentioned, I just moved to Louisiana. I would never be able to, especially during these times, get to New York to actually stand there and see it. But here we see it clear as day. Now it's a little unclear because over time, trees and shrubs and all of those things. So it's actually, this is the marker that says, Sojourner Truth was born here. This is a great place to commemorate, but it's actually across the water. So if you look kind of across into the shrubbery back there, at one point in time that was cleared out, and that was where her birthplace actually was. So that's pretty cool. And so I actually was able to find, so I'm really excited about this too. This is a picture of the estate that was taken over a century after she was actually there. And so this was a major historical find for me from the Library of Congress, because any of you know about the Library of Congress, they have tons and tons and tons of stuff. They also have a lot of unmarked things and miscellaneous things because, they're keeping archives, but not everything is specifically attributed to something. And so for me, I was determined to figure out where she lived, who these people were, who the colonel was. And so I was searching through New York records and locations and trying to find exactly who this person was. What wasn't very helpful is that a lot of his family also had the same name. So I was finding tons of stuff that had nothing to do with it. But I was able to find the specific place where his name was misspelled because his name is a little bit more complex, right? So it was actually misspelled and categorized in some miscellaneous place, just as this image of this house. And it wasn't attributed to Sojourner Truth. It wasn't attributed to that era. And so I was able to actually attribute it to Sojourner Truth's birthplace. And it debuted here in this exhibit as, a historical find. So yeah, I was really, really excited about that. And it's, a wonderful opportunity to see exactly the conditions and where she was born. And so Hardenberg actually owned 6 slaves on his estate. And when Truth was born, her parents, James and Elizabeth, were required to work on the estate in exchange for a small cottage and farmland to cultivate crops, just enough for them to live. So it wasn't like, any real kind of wage or exchange of equal value. They just were given the bare minimum. But unfortunately, shortly after Truth was born, Hardenberg died and his son Charles inherited the estate. And so when Charles moved in, it went even further downhill. So he removed Truth and the family from their cottage and kept them in a dark cellar of the house. And, all of the other enslaved people also lived there with him. So it was, pretty difficult. And then, later on, we're able to see that she moves. So at a very young age, she becomes quickly acclimated to the realities of what enslavement looked like. And that experience of being dehumanized and being trafficked. And so at first, she's living in this cellar with so many other enslaved people and their families. And she herself was the youngest of 10 children. But then, as she put in her own words, as she's growing up, many of her siblings were kidnapped, what she calls kidnapped. And she later realized that they weren't kidnapped. Well, they were kidnapped, but it wasn't just like stealing children to steal them. Although that is also bad, but they were stealing them and selling them in the enslavement enterprise. And so Truth herself was actually sold by the time she was 9 years old, she was sold for the first time. And then she was sold twice within a 2-year period before she was actually sold to her final enslaver, who was John Dumont. And so this is where my personal research comes in, as well. As Liz mentioned, I look at the sale and separation of enslaved families and how enslaved children and spouses were frequently ripped away from each other and many times they never saw each other again. And so Truth's childhood is an example of just how often and how pervasive this phenomenon was of separating people due to enslavement. And so another interesting fact about her, though, is that as she's growing up, many of the enslaved Africans that lived in the rural areas surrounding New York State were Afro-Dutch. And I had no idea until I started doing this research that when they were learning their first language, many times it was Dutch, right? Like, who knew? So this was very true of Truth and her family, and their first language was Dutch as well. Unfortunately, when Truth was sold to her first master, John Neely, he and his family only spoke English. And so in her autobiography, she vividly talks about this, where she was brutally beaten because she didn't understand them speaking to her in English and demanding things from her in English. In addition, if you remember, as I mentioned, she was only sold at 9. So imagine being 9 years old, not speaking the language, being sold off by yourself, not understanding, and then being beaten for it, beating for not understanding, right? And so that was the beginning of what eventually became her experience with the enslavement enterprise, but also with violence, unfortunately. And so over her lifetime, she learned to speak English fluently, but she never lost her Dutch accent or learned how to read or write. And so remember that, because that'll be important later. I'm going to talk about that. But she continued to speak English with a Dutch accent. And so this image that I included here was, I believe, from a newspaper. And at the time, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of propaganda, a lot of things in newspapers talking about what was happening at the time. And this was actually a part of this stereotype around enslaved women and children, that they were these infiltrators that would destroy families, and they were often seen as hypersexual or oversexual. So they would steal the men from their wives. And so as young children, like Sojourner Truth, were going into these homes because they were sold, there was this stereotype that these children would be somehow detrimental to the slave master's family. And so at the bottom, the quote is, "family amalgamation among the men stealers." And that's how she was perceived, right? As a 9-year-old child going into this house. And so, as I mentioned earlier as well, she frequently encountered or experienced or even witnessed violence in her life due to, the brutality of slavery at the time. And so when she lived actually later on the plantation of John Dumont, she actually fell in love with this enslaved man named Robert. And in her autobiography and in what Dr. Painter talks about this period of her life, she talks about being, in love with this man, and he would frequently come to see her, and, really, really actually wanting to be with this person, right? But his masters, the Catlins, so Robert's masters were the Catlins, and they didn't want Robert to have children that they couldn't benefit from, because they decided the relationship wasn't going to be profitable. They couldn't, if Sojourner Truth and Robert had children, those children wouldn't belong to the Catlins. They would actually belong to the plantation Truth was on. And so the relationship didn't make sense to them. And so in her autobiography, Truth recalls Robert often sneaking off to the farm and visiting her when she was sick. But because the Catlins decided that was not a relationship they wanted to condone, they forbid them from seeing each other. And when they found out that he was actually going to see her, they found him, and she said they, quote, fell upon him like tigers. So they tied his hands and severely beat him. And after that, Robert never came back, couldn't come back. And he was, visibly, according to her, what she had heard, was visibly upset and somber, and married a woman from that farm, from his farm. And then Truth ended up marrying a man from the Dumont farm, and eventually had 5 children. I remember that she had 5 children. And because both of those plantations couldn't benefit from the labor, they decided, yeah, you guys can't be together. And so they both had to have children that corresponded with where they were, considered property. And so this is important too, because after the abolition of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade in 1807-08, so they're not, the enterprise is not getting enslaved people from Africa or shipping them in. They then decide, oh, it's actually cheaper to have enslaved people reproduce, and we can build and grow our enslaved population that way. And so that was a main part of what we see here, is they want to build and grow their enslaved population, their labor force, and they can't do that if the child belongs to someone else. And so that's essentially how things are running at the time. And so after that, after years of enduring some of that, physical and sexual abuse, Truth walked to freedom. Yes, I said it. She walked to freedom. But let me preface that by saying, of course, it wasn't that easy. She didn't just get up one day and decide, you know what, I'm going to pack my luggage and walk off. So it wasn't necessarily exactly like that. And her situation also wasn't everyone's situation. So there's tons of complexities and so many stories. But in this one instance, she had made a deal with her enslaver Dumont, and he agreed to grant her freedom on July 4th, 1826. But in many instances this happened, right? So they would work for a certain amount of time and agree, like, okay, I'll let you go on this date. And then when that date comes, yeah, right, they're not going to let them go, because this is labor. This is the ability for them to get things done for free. So when the time came, Dumont refused to release her. And then Truth took matters into her own hands. And she was inspired by faith, which is what this program is called, right? She was inspired by her conversations with God and, really this feeling, spiritual feeling that she needed to be free. And so she ran away from Dumont's farm just before dawn to get away undetected. And so although Dumont did pursue her, so he ran after her, she was able to stay with the Van Wegnens, who were members of the Dutch Reformed Church that she eventually starts to ascribe to for a bit. And along her journey, she was baptized with the Holy Spirit, which is a spiritual process that she, ascribed to. And she was compelled, to change her name to Sojourner Truth during that time. I'm not particularly sure why she chose that. But I do know that she considered herself to be a sojourner, to be on the journey. And so I think that's a part of what inspired her. And then later in her autobiography, so remember, I told you to remember she couldn't read or write, but we have an autobiography. How did that happen? Because she dictated her autobiography. So she was so committed to telling her story that she said, oh, I'm going to tell someone to write this down, and had someone write for her. And it's called The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. And it focused on her religious experiences that motivated her to seek justice. And so we call it The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, but it actually has a much longer title. It's actually Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a bondswoman of olden time, emancipated by the New York legislator in the early part of the present century, with a history of her labors and correspondence drawn from her book of life. I know, long title. And then this image I actually included another one, but it got switched out because of, the curator's background, right? Some of the lighting needs to be right and all of that. So we went with this one, and I wanted to find something that reflect kind of the Dutch ancestry. And this is a Rembrandt. So in perhaps one of the most famous contributions, right? So after she's walking to freedom, she starts really being inspired to speak and preach and tell her story. And so one of her most famous speeches was her "Ain't I a Woman" speech, or "Aren't I a Woman?" And so this happened on May 28th, 1851. And so this is, that's another Google image of the area. Don't you love those? I love those. So this was in Akron, Ohio. And this is when a large group assembled for the Women's Rights Convention. So this is important because this is one of the most famous things we see and hear about her, right? But I think, you know, which I'll mention later, one, she's misquoted, but two, right, we celebrate this, but for one, Truth wasn't even invited to this event. So that's important to note. This wasn't, I kind of talked about earlier, her facing discrimination, not only as an African-American, but also as a woman. On both sides, she faced this discrimination. So she wasn't invited, but so many times we tell the story about how awesome it was and how accepted and celebrated she was, but she wasn't invited. And she had been going to other conventions and actively advocating for women's rights and attending different things. But this wasn't something that, you know, she was openly invited to attend. But she attended the meeting and she spoke up during the discussion. So it also wasn't like she was given the podium, she did this speech, woo, yay, Sojourner Truth. She actually spoke from the floor during an open discussion and was like, hey, excuse me, I have something to say, right? And so that's also part of the way that we tell the stories, a little bit different from, you know, what we know about her today. And so the words that Truth spoke at this meeting were thoughtful and reflective of the social climate. However, a decade after the convention was held, fellow attendee Frances Dana Gage, who's also an activist in women's rights advocate, decided to change and manipulate Truth's actual words to create a speech entitled, "Aren't I a Woman?" And so Gage published this report of Truth's words in the New York Independent, and it was 4 times longer than what Truth actually said. And unfortunately, Gage's fabricated speech then became the dominant version, as "Aren't I a Woman" was kind of the thing that resonated with so many people, even though it misrepresented what Truth was actually saying. But now it's considered historical fact, right? And so I have a video of it, but I'm gonna just, for a second, I'm gonna reshare just to make sure I have the sound on so you can see it. Okay, so you can hear it.
Here, the black abolitionist Sojourner Truth, who was freed from slavery in 1827, speaks to a gathering of feminists in Akron, Ohio in 1851.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's right, honey. intellect. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him.
Okay, that's a brief overview. It doesn't go on for very much longer, but I would suggest taking a look at it so you can hear the whole speech. But essentially, although it's powerful and funny and, you know, says a lot in it, it condemned gender inequality and detailed her strength and ability to work and the loss of her 13 children. These things were important and impactful. However, they're not at all what Sojourner Truth said. And so what's important to note about this, so I mentioned a few things for us to remember. One, she had 5 children. Remember I said that earlier? So this talked about her having 13 children and not know, you know, what is intellect and all of these things. I also mentioned, right, she had a Dutch accent because her first language was Dutch. But Gage writes the speech, as historians now call it, in a slave dialect. So essentially, you know, a broken down kind of English for people who may not have necessarily learned to read or write. That's not necessarily how she would have spoke. And it also kind of reinforces stereotypes of enslaved women and evokes this imagery of being strong and, you know, only caring about working and doing whatever they can for their masters, but still being a part of this larger society that they can do exactly everything that somebody else can do, which, you know, again, is powerful, but it further perpetuates this idea that dehumanizes the truth of who she is, right? And so the actual truth is that she attended many meetings denouncing slavery and sexism, even though in this particular instance, she wasn't a registered attendee, but she also, it's suspected that she also attended the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention and maintained complex relationships with all of these leaders of the movement. And I say complex because she often had to challenge activists that were seeking liberation, but liberation that didn't necessarily include enslaved women, or liberation that manipulated or depicted enslaved women in particular ways like this one did, right? And so, for example, with Frederick Douglass, who was a famous and renowned abolitionists, right? They were friends and their children were friends, but at times he was just advocating for African Americans and not necessarily taking into consideration that for African American women, it was a little bit different because they faced other things that also limited them from participating fully in democracy, as well as with Elizabeth Stanton, right, was advocating for women, but not necessarily enslaved people at all times. So at a time she did, but then when it wasn't beneficial, she was like, well, I think actually let's advocate for women first. But then, you know, as an African-American woman, Sojourner Truth still wasn't included in the liberation that Katie Stanton was seeking, right? So that they were complex relationships, but she still worked alongside them, and, you know, during various moments of her life, saw them as friends and confidants. And so one of her friends, Marius Robinson, published a more accurate account of what Sojourner Truth's speech actually was in the Anti-Slavery Bugle, which was only a few weeks after the convention of 1851. And so, you know, it was documented a few weeks after, which is important, versus Gage's rendering, which was so long after, because as we know, right, proximity to the event often helps with accuracy, right? So, I can't remember what I had for breakfast 3 days ago, much less what I had today, but I have a better chance of remembering that today versus however many days prior. And so that proximity to the event as a historian or as a person recording history is important. And so we kind of get a more accurate glimpse of what she would have said. And so I wanted to briefly show you that.
May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's right. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plucked and chopped and mowed and husked, and can any man do more than that? I have heard about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights, for fear we will take too much. For we can't take more than our pint to hold anyways.
And I'll stop it there and also suggest that you listen to the full one as well. Now, so that is a little bit different, right? Because one, her dialect is different. She doesn't mention anything about her children. And she also, later on in the speech says, essentially, I can do all these things, and I too am a woman. Right. And that was the most important part of, what she was saying. I too, in addition to all of these things, I am also a woman. I am also a part of what is happening in my society. I also am an intellectual. I also can, be a part of this conversation as many times as they try to keep me out of it. I too am a part of this. And that's really so important to who she was as a person and who she continues to be in our memory, and someone who's advocating for her seat at the table, essentially, right? And so that's really important about how we continue to learn more about Sojourner Truth. And so during the Civil War, her activism continued. So not only was she an activist for women's rights and for African Americans, she also was fighting for various forms of justice. And so during the Civil War, she advocated for Union soldiers, and she assisted them in their efforts to, sometimes she would bring food, she would, collect money with other people to kind of go door to door. For example, with the 1st Michigan Regiment of the Colored Soldiers in Detroit, she was collecting food and made a whole spread and feast for some of them during Thanksgiving. And so that's the kind of person she was, that was always trying to advocate for people's needs. And so it wasn't necessarily just with women's rights or just with African American rights. She was just looking out for people and meeting their basic needs, essentially. So at the end of the war, she actually visited President Lincoln on October 29th, 1864 in the White House. And I would suggest that you Google that, because there are some really great images. People have recreated that image of her and President Lincoln, even though it's not an actual photograph. And so I would check that out, because it's really interesting to kind of see that. And then I included here a beautiful picture of Truth at another moment of her life that's also kind of involved in this civil rights activism. Her grandson, James Caldwell, also was actively supporting the Union. So in April of 1863, Caldwell volunteered for the Massachusetts 54th the 1st Black Regiment of Massachusetts. And so in this portrait, we see Truth holding a photo of her grandson. And also remember, I talked about kind of the separation during slavery and the jarring effects of people being ripped away. But then there are also these beautiful moments of her holding this photo of her grandson and being proud of what he's doing, and really being sentimental, right? And so I think that's a beautiful image that we get to see of her. And I mentioned as well that she is, her and Frederick Douglass were friends. And so I think their grandsons served together and had, some kind of connections in that way, which is really cool. I'm just imagining that wonderful activism friendship. So after the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation did not mean retirement. So she kept fighting for justice until her last breath. She continued to advocate and speak out in the name of justice under her God, with her faith, right? And so she famously fought for issues like the resettled settlement of freed people. So as I was telling you, she's just an activist for people who need things, right? So people who needed housing and needed food, she wanted to advocate for them. And that actually is something we don't really talk much about, what she, her doing that, but she was very much helpful in trying to get people food and housing and resources, and also women's suffrage, as we know. And then in her final years, she lived with her daughters in Battle Creek, Michigan. So Truth then died of natural causes after a long life, a beautiful life of activism, and of, she at one point in time purchases her own home, which is amazing for a woman at the time and for a Black woman at the time. And there's actually in the Library of Congress, I think there's like a copy of the deed to her house, which is really cool. And then so she dies of natural causes on November 26, 1883. And remember, I told you also, she didn't know how old she was. She didn't know when she was born. And so probably due to her wisdom and her experiences, her family thought she was 105 years old when she died, but she was actually only about 86. So that, is interesting. But since her death, of course, we've seen Truth everywhere. Her images and renderings and her likeness are on so many things, and she's in so many history books and the subject of Black History Month programs like this. And I think most recently, the Treasury, back in 2020, announced that she would be featured on the $10 bill along with so many other suffrages. And so I hope to see that sometime soon. I'm not sure of the status on that, but I can't wait to see Sojourner Truth on my money. But essentially, that is the remarkable story of Sojourner Truth. And I hope that you have, enjoyed some of these beautiful moments that I found to be so powerful. And I encourage you to continue to look into her and hear more about how inspiring she was. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Liz.
Well, thank you so much, Kerri. I guess that as we, just a reminder to everybody, if you have any questions to ask Kerri, please send those through the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can before our time ends today. But the first thing that I want to do is ask you, with this exhibit, I know that it kind of was something that Google approached us and asked us if we would be interested in doing this exhibit. And you very kindly and wonderfully stepped in and put this together. And it also wound up being the Google Doodle for Black History Month. Can you just take a minute or two as we're waiting for some questions to come in to just kind of talk about that experience and putting the exhibit together and having it be something that we didn't imagine that it could be, and how amazing it was?
Absolutely. So yeah, it was definitely for one, a beautiful experience, because as I mentioned, I'm, in my research, I talk about enslaved people during the same time period. And so when we were approached, I was immediately like, yes, 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 I'll do it. And so it was exciting to do that. but then also to see, you know, one, it was a shock. It was almost like an overnight thing when they decided to put it on the homepage, and to see how many people were responding to it. And that's actually something, so one of the people from the Google representative emailed and said, hey, you know, we are excited too, because we're seeing so many people responding to this, especially to something that's as important as her story. I'm so glad that people of all ages are experiencing, you know, these pieces of her life. And so, you know, for me, that was, I think, perhaps the most important part, is that people got to hear and see more about her, and got to see her actual words, even though they were, you know, so famously misquoted, to actually see that and to kind of start to reveal, you know, more about her truth, you know, pun intended. I think that was a lot of fun. So, yeah.
So we've had a few questions regarding, you know, her time as an enslaved woman. You know, one of the questions was, how could she travel to preach if she was enslaved? How did she earn or obtain her freedom? Which I think this question may have come in before you talked about that a little bit more. But if you could kind of touch on that question. And then we also had a question that goes along with that, asking about, you mentioned that she was purchased and sold, and within the span of 2 years, you know, several times. Why would you make such a purchase of someone only to sell them the next year? Was this common to be sold repeatedly, especially in such a short amount of time?
Absolutely. So I'll address both those. Firstly, yeah, so later on, she then, you know, is able to get to freedom and then travels. And so what's beautiful about her story is also that she has connections to different people. So as I mentioned, she was connected with the Dutch reformers, the Van Wagens or something. I butchered the last name, but with them, they were able to help resource her. And so she stayed with them when she was hiding out from Dumont. And so people like that would along the way be of help to her as she would go from place to place and live on very little. And I think they helped fund her as she went, as well as other places that she would preach. They would, you know, give her a small stipend or a few things, or food or a place to stay for her to preach there. And so she did what she could. And as she continued to climb kind of through these activist circles, she was able to get friends and resources and things like that, and earn little money where she could in freedom that would help her move. And so that is, you know, essentially kind of how she was navigating. And then in terms of being sold, so a lot of the times, you know, when people are bought and sold, it's based on whatever the enslaver needs in terms of labor. And so, you know, if that enslaved, you know, person wasn't exactly the, you know, the height or the durability or the age that that person needed, they would then be sold. Or, and a lot of times people were either bequeathed. So if, you know, someone died, a person was gifted to another person. Or if they had to pay off a debt, they would give an enslaved person as a type of currency. So there was a lot of reasons that people were moved or sold or given away. And so it really was an unstable enterprise, which is why, you know, I'm studying it, because there's so much to learn about how frequent and how, you know, how that actually happened. And so, but yeah, you know, people were moved very frequently. Yeah.
And inspired with the clips that you played with the Ain't I a Woman speech or the Aren't I a Woman speech, how did you, or how were her actual words discovered versus the made up speech? Because, you know, as we know, the speech that has become the most widely known speech is the version that is not the correct version. So how did we kind of get back to knowing what her true words were and whether or not those were also correct?
Absolutely. So Dr. Painter, Nell Irvin Painter, was, you know, she did a lot of research, but people prior to as well started to discover, one, the Bugle, which is where the actual words were published. But then two, people looking deeper into Sojourner Truth's story saw that, wait a minute, this thing was written so much after the speech. Do we have anything closer or anything that might actually be a little bit more vividly retelling that time period of history, as well as women's studies has developed and people were looking into that convention. They said, wait, there's some more information around this convention, and there's some more renderings. And then we saw the inconsistencies. And so that project that I played, actually on their website, they have a side-by-side of the two speeches. So you can actually go back and forth, which is what I did as well, to see kind of the differences. But people started doing that very early on to say, wait, these actually don't necessarily match up. And so in Painter's book, she kind of talks about where that comes from, how we see gauge, and so many people, specifically abolitionists at the time would sometimes kind of change words because they felt, it's almost like how we know what will sell in commercials. They did the same thing with words and with stories back then. And so that's how we ended up where we are today, and now knowing that, wait a minute, this wasn't actually what she said. So yeah.
And in one of the virtual field trips that I do, we talk a lot about Sojourner Truth, and I play the clip, the second clip that you played, and it's so powerful to listen to the dialect and those words in what would have been her voice. I think that really makes quite an impact when you play that.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about her, her husband and children. What became of them after she escaped to freedom? Were they supportive of her advocating for women's rights and Black women's rights?
Yeah, so not a lot is known, but some is known. So one of her children actually was sold away from her. I think a few of them were, but I know specifically one of her children was sold away, right? Talking about this sale and separation. And she later on, I believe she sues for ownership of her son, or for her son to come back. But what was, kind of painful about that story, and I believe her husband as well, right? So they're all kind of separated and scattered. And so when she gets her freedom, she is seeking to, get them back, or to be in, at least be in, some type of relative community with them. What's kind of heartbreaking about her story is at one point she, sues and tries to get her son back. And when she eventually is able to, her son is so conditioned to other people because he hasn't grown up with her, lived with her. Her son is kind of like, I don't want to go with you. I don't know you, right? And so I'm reading this story like, my God, plot twist. This is crazy that eventually, when she actually gets them, her son is like, no. And so that kind of shows you the detrimental effects of this, enslavement system. But, eventually she's able to reconnect with, some of them, and then goes on to have grandchildren, and then eventually lives with her daughters, who she is able to reconnect with as well. So she does have, a relatively happier ending than some of the endings that we do see in the historical archives.
And one of the questions, and thinking about the 1800s, we don't have highways, we don't have cars, and she did a lot of traveling. Seneca Falls, she's in Washington, D.C., she's in Battle Creek, Michigan, she's in Akron, Ohio. How does she get from place to place? I mean, what is that like for her as she's traveling, especially as a Black woman traveling in this particular time period?
Yeah, absolutely. So, early on, actually, she traveled when she was still enslaved, traveled on foot from place to place sometimes. And so she would have to walk alongside, and so many were forced to walk alongside carriages and things like that. Later on, she's able to, again, be resourced and funded by people who support her, and, get a horse or a carriage from here to here, or make many stops along the way as she's, making day trips, that kind of thing. And so that's essentially how she's getting from place to place. And, there's also, later on, she gets to the UK, which I'm like, how? But I think, she was able to get on a boat with some cargo and get to the UK. So she is making moves, but she also is representative of so many people at the time who were also doing whatever they can to get from place to place, to get to their freedom. So I know the story of Margaret Garner, who's someone who's enslaved during that time as well. She gets to freedom on a sled. Okay, she gets, like, it's not a modern sled, but like they put things together to make like a sled. And in order for her to get across ice, she like, it's basically a sled, and her family get on this thing and like slide across to get to the freedom, right? So they're innovative in how they're able to travel and get from place to place, which is remarkable to me.
Yeah. And can you speak a little bit to her time in Washington, D.C., and her meeting with President Lincoln? Just, say a few words about that as well.
Yeah, so she meets with Lincoln, and this is all after kind of her being known as someone who is advocating for rights. And so he sees fit to have her there. And she also is like, I'm not just here for, pictures and the photo op. I'm here because there are freed people who need resources. There are things that need to happen, right? I'm advocating for, further abolition because it's essentially a gradual abolition. It's not like just everybody's free. There's so many more conditions and so many people who are still enslaved, right? So she is, like, look, I'm here to do business, which is what I love about her and I love about this time. But that, is really a powerful image of her also just advocating for herself, even as a Black woman, going into these spaces and saying, look, I have something to say. And so I think that's also just a part of her story and who she was.
Yeah. You mentioned a little bit about her preaching about how she found, salvation through Jesus. Are there copies of her sermons available, or have those survived? Are those things that we can find? And if so, where?
Yeah, so I know in her autobiography, she has pieces of things and writings. There's also this one story about her, which I think is so remarkable, that she sang. She was a singer. And so she has like written like songs, spiritual hymns essentially, that she didn't write, but that were dictated or things like that she sang or were a part of. And so people have written stories. If you search on both Library of Congress, and there's this other resource that I use called Documenting the American South. And if you look on Documenting the American South and search Sojourner Truth, you're able to see some more pieces of what she's left behind. And she also wrote more than, she also dictated more than just her autobiography. I think she has a few other things out there as well. Yes. And so if you check those out, you'll be able to find some more information about her and about what she's saying and singing, which I love during this time.
And I've just actually put the Documenting the American South link into the chat for everybody. If you all are interested, that is in the chat as well. We have time, I think, for one final question. And one of the images that you showed in the presentation that's included in the exhibit is this beautiful carte de visite, which is the presentation with her at a table with the flowers. Were there more cards? Can you speak a little bit more about those cards? What were they? How were they used, and what was their purpose?
So I can't speak too much to that, but I do know that she, in a lot of the images that we do have of her, we kind of had to find them, right? And so for a very long time, we only had one or two images of her, and we kept seeing the same images, and the same images of, what's happening. And so by this time now, we're seeing so much more, which I think is such a beautiful representation of who she is. We can get all of these images and learn much more, even just from what we're seeing instead of what we're reading. So that's why I'm, committed to continue to look into her story, to continue to find these things, because, you know, that they make her story so much richer.
Mm-hmm. And that's a beautiful thing, is we are continuing to find new information and new images and new stories as well, which, you know, helps add to the narrative and the context and kind of filling in the blanks of this remarkable story as well.
Yeah.
Well, Kerri, thank you so very, very much for being with us today, for sharing this powerful story about this absolutely inspirational woman. We very much thank you for the time. I know it's been a little bit of a crazy week with you with your move. But just a reminder that this presentation today is being recorded. It will be available on our website sometime this week. It will be on the Sundays at Home tab under the Public Programs and Events page. If you enjoyed today's program, please join us during Women's History Month. On Monday, March 8th, we will be showing the first of a two-part film screening of PBS's And She Could Be Next, with a moderated conversation to follow with the filmmakers. And She Could Be Next tells the story of a defiant movement of women of color transforming politics from the ground up. It's a two-part series that follows candidates and organizers across the country asking whether democracy itself can be preserved and made stronger by those most marginalized. A screening and conversation of episode 1 will take place on Monday, March 8th. A screening and conversation with episode 2 will take place 1 week later on Monday, March 15th. On March 11th, educators from the National Portrait Gallery, the National Air and Space Museum, and the National Women's History Museum will get together to discuss how historical objects from their respective collections speak to today's social justice issues and explore the key question of what does a leader do in relationship to portraits of activist Sojourner Truth, Sylvia Rivera, and pilot Bessie Coleman. All of these events are free. Advanced registration is required. That's all on our Eventbrite pages. More details and registration information can be found on womenshistory.org. So Kerri, thank you again so very much. It's great to see you. We appreciate your time. We wish you the absolute best in luck in your new endeavor in Louisiana, and we certainly hope to see you again very soon. So thank you. Thank you to everybody for being with us today. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and we will see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.